All right. Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. We have a very inspiring conversation planned for all of you. We're joined by Ed from Reach Foundation. He's the managing director at Reach. And we'll hear all about the work that Reach does. But organizations like Reach deeply inspire the work that we do at the Circle, where we are reinventing schools, after schools, and teacher training institutions so that they could empower children in low income communities to thrive and also change their communities for the better. Some of the ways that we do that is through these short conversations that spark insight and also through other cohort-based program where we invite people to think about what would reinvention mean for their communities. We also do this through a 2-year full-time incubation for entrepreneurs who want to design schools or after schools of their own in their own low-income context. The applications for this 2-year incubation are open now. We'll just put the link to our website where you can find a link to register. And if you'd also want to chat about it, feel free to reach out. All right, we're just going to move into the session right now. Thank you so much for joining us, Ed. We'll have a time to just talk to Ed and ask our questions towards the end, but feel free to keep populating the chat with any insights that are coming up as we go on. And I'm just going to hand this over to Cindy.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that, Amina. Hi, everybody. It's good to see a lot of familiar faces here. Not faces, but names. And I think I know people are going to still be trickling in, but I'm also quite excited about doing this as a bit of an intimate conversation over the course of the next hour and a half. I also know that many of the people in this group are people who are either running schools or are thinking about running schools. And so I think this discussion should be a lot of fun, and it should be impactful. We take our entrepreneurs within the incubation to the UK to be able to basically learn from some of the schools there each year. And one of the first nudges that I got whenever we were actually trying to visit schools, people are like, you just have to see the work at Reach. And people just kept I think 5 different people told me saying you just have to be able to see the work at Reach. And I think while we weren't able to actually see the work at Reach, I think everything that I have heard, and including watching Ed present the work has just pointed just to some really incredible, transformative work with kids that is happening on the ground that is basically built by more than a decade of going at it, and that work has been built around how do you actually take students from cradle to career? How do you build out an ecosystem of support that basically guarantees transformation for kids? And then eventually, how do you basically figure out how to scale that to many, many more? Ed is a leader who has really been trying to crack this, not only by running a school himself, but by trying to take that to many more schools by starting, what is basically a hub for kids by basically starting, an academy, has added so much to this. So when you look at the through line through that, I was actually going through all of the different programs, right, that Reach runs. And I was sitting there thinking, wait a minute, the big through line through all of this is actually it's one big question, which is how do we do right by kids? And in doing right by kids, how do we actually do what is needed next? And you can actually see the logical progression through that. And so I left all of that thinking if we can figure out how to bring that to India, if we can figure out how to basically just obsess about that question, but also learn from someone who has really basically been obsessively thinking about that for more than a decade, I think we can actually do something pretty special for kids here. So with that, Ed, first of all, gratitude, I think, for not only coming here, but also just for all that you do, and the incredible person that you are. Incredibly grateful to have you here, I think, to be learning from you and to be in this conversation with you. We'll hand this over to you now.
Great. Well, look, that's very, very kind words. I don't know how true it is, but anyway, it's very generous of you. Lovely to see everybody. Really grateful to all of you for joining in the evening. It's kind of beginning of the afternoon here in London. It's a bright day, and yeah, it's great to be having this conversation. So a little bit about me. I was in the first cohort that did the Teach for India equivalent program in the UK in 2003. taught in a few different schools in London, in secondary schools, moved out of schools for a few years, ended up working for Teach for All, the international network of organizations like Teach for India, for a few years. And then when we had the opportunity to open a new school, as Sandeep said, I came back to the UK to do that. And we serve a community that's about 10 minutes south of Heathrow Airport, so in the kind of southwest corner of London. A pretty mixed community in terms of ethnicity, a kind of relatively underserved community, although it's worth saying that in general, children in London perform better and get a better quality education than in other parts of the UK. We're the only capital city in Europe where that is the case. So it's quite unusual, but children in London have a pretty good overall experience. About 40% of our children of our cohort are living in poverty, unfortunately, and they access kind of some additional support in terms of like free school meals and so on. And I wanted to set up a school because I was really interested in that all through journey. So that journey that takes children from kind of cradle to career, as Sandeep said, and was interested in how could we build a school that was trying to support every single child to flourish. I think in England in the last 20 years, we've got better at helping the really highest attaining children growing up in poverty to access the best opportunities. So for example, when I went to university, I was at the University of Cambridge. There were more children from Eton College, which is a fee-paying school. There were more children from Eton College at Cambridge than there were children who had grown up in poverty in the rest of the country combined. There were almost none of those young people. And so we've got much better at that over the last 20 years, but still we have a very, very wide attainment gap. Post-COVID, children are going to school much less regularly than they were before, about 10 percentage points less. We have huge challenges with special educational needs. We are close to kind of bankrupting actually our system because we have such increasing level of special educational need. We've got challenges around trust between schools and parents. Again, I think coming out of COVID. So we've got various challenges. But what I hope to do today is kind of talk a little bit about Reach and about our story and about some of the things we do. I'm going to talk about kind of 4 different areas. I'm going to share my screen to be able to do that. So I'm just putting my language on. Okay, so we have this aspiration that we are trying to, our aim is that children who come to our school, and indeed all children in England, we want them to be able to enjoy a life of choice and opportunity. And that's our kind of why. And our analysis is that very often, where that is not the case, where children don't enjoy a life of choice and opportunity, it's very often because they are experiencing an incoherent system. So the experience they have kind of is educationally incoherent. That means that between phases of education, so between early years and primary, between primary and secondary and kind of post-16 and beyond, there's a lack of coherence, a thread that runs through. They also experience kind of a lack of relational coherence. So the relationships that they and their families build with institutions, whether that's schools or other types of support, is not consistent, is not strong. And then thirdly, that there's a lack of coherence in terms of the support that's provided. We talk about kind of local system coherence, but the support that's available to families and to young people is often very siloed, is often very separated into different types of support, and that makes it harder for families often. And so we want this for every child, and I'm going to kind of whiz through 4 things that I think we've worked really hard on at Reach Academy. So one of them around curriculum. I'm going to be quite brief with these so that we can get into a discussion. One of them around teachers, and I think at that point we're going to watch a little bit of some film footage of our school. One then around relationships with families, and one around communities. And what I would say is, I think in the UK, our system as a whole has invested a lot in the top two in the last 15 years. So we've invested a lot in England in our curriculum, in supporting teacher development. We've probably done less on the last two. Now that may be different in your communities, in your context, but that's been our experience. So probably the more innovative of our work is more on the last two. The top two are, I think, strengths, but they're not necessarily as different to other schools in the UK. So we started with this all through school in Feltham, and as Sandeep said, we've ended up running a range of other services, both in our locality and nationally, but I'm going to talk a lot about the school. We wanted to do an all through school. At the heart of it was because we think the biggest factor that determines how well young people do at school is the strength of the relationship between their teachers, them as individuals, and their family. And that kind of triangle feels really important. And so having that all through gave us the most chance of sustaining a really strong relationship. In general, in the UK, the relationship is strongest when the child is youngest, and then it slowly goes down, like right the way through their time at school. And similarly, that's also true of our school attendance in the UK. So children's attendance is best when they're very young, and then attendance in school drops as children go through. And similarly, there's some quite interesting research coming out at the moment about engagement and measures of engagement, which is apparently quite a good proxy for how children will do. And again, engagement, so that's kind of participation in, enjoyment of school, starts to fall when children are in year 3. So that's when they're about 7 years old, and then drops very fast when they go to secondary school at 11, and then drops very, very fast in their second year of secondary school. So that's when they get when they're 12. And so for us, we wanted to have that continuity of experience. And as you can see on this slide, it talks about having really high expectations for what every young person can achieve. That felt very important to us. So this is our recent inspection. It was last September. You can see the school has developed a really good reputation. You can read that inspection report. It's not very interesting, but that's kind of a measure of success. Our young people do pretty well. They have a good experience. It's a pretty high performing school. So I'm gonna kind of dive into these different areas, as I say, and I'll be quite brief on them. But the first thing is, I think, around curriculum. And I think there are 3 things that really matter. One of the ways I think that schools can guarantee that educational coherence is to do this kind of backwards planning. So is to start with the end in mind. So one of the things that we have for each of our year groups is, at 18, what do we want children to be able to do in this subject? And then we work back from that to describe what that will look like at the different levels. And what you see in that is that there is some overlap, but also some significant difference with our national curriculum. And in general, we have realized that we needed to increase the rigor of our curriculum in order to make sure that our children were able to flourish at the next stage. The second thing is about the depth and the quality of the resources that are available. This is one of our knowledge organizers. This is an example of some of the learning materials that we've developed. One of the biggest challenges that we have found, particularly for our teachers teaching primary, teaching elementary, is the subject knowledge required to teach such a range of subjects to a high standard is really challenging. And so for us, providing really high quality learning resources that provide the right kind of support for teachers to be able to teach well has been really important. And then the third thing is about the assessment. And one of the most useful things that we have done, and we do it very regularly, is to revisit what's the type of work, what's the quality of work, what's the quality of writing, or the problems that pupils will be able to solve at the different levels that give us confidence that they're on track to this kind of ambitious destination that we have for them. And so articulating, like describing what that looks like. And one of the things that I haven't shared here, but we have is these sorts of examples of pupils' work, but annotated, describing exactly what it is that makes this a really strong piece of work for a pupil in year 5 or in year 6. And so the first thing that I think is really important is this idea of curriculum being backwards planned, curriculum being carefully resourced, and then curriculum being rigorously assessed with a very clear sense of what the endpoint is. And so I'm going to keep going, but we can come back to any of these if it's useful to talk more about them. The second one is this point around helping teachers to get better all of the time. And as I'm sure the evidence that we have in the UK suggests that the biggest factor influencing how well kids do in school is the quality of the teacher in front of them. The other thing that is interesting is that most teachers improve for the first 2 years, and then their teaching plateaus, so it stops improving. And so the ability to help teachers to continue to get better feels like it's a really important kind of opportunity. And there are sort of 5 things that we do that we think are important to helping our teachers to get better. Some of these things, I think, have evolved significantly in the last few years, in the sense that I think we have for a long time defined great teaching in detail, but we haven't necessarily given our teachers what we would call the kind of mental model, the kind of geography for thinking about the way of thinking about teaching as a whole. And so what you have on the screen is an example of a kind of mental model of teaching. So a way that teaching is organized. I'm so sorry, I've done that now. Hopefully that's better. A way that teachers can think about teaching that helps them to organize all of the professional development that they receive. And this is another way of thinking about this is some of the persistent problems that teachers face. And you can see that these areas are numbered. And we think of this as quite helpful to have this as an order of operations. So there's a question initially about how is the teacher designing the curriculum and what children are learning. Is it designed well? Are the right ideas selected? And then it goes through, if the teacher can't secure attention, then there's no point worrying about the feedback and the assessment and the driving thought and so on. And so we would want all of our teachers to share this kind of mental model. And I think this is a step that for a long time we neglected. We didn't spend enough time on this. I'm just looking at. I'm gonna come back to the questions at the end if that's okay, because otherwise I'm gonna struggle. I'm not very good at multitasking. You know what it's like. So keep putting them in, but I'm going to come to them at the end. So having this as a starting point gives a kind of way for teachers to order and to think about the development experiences that they're having. The second thing that we do is that we break down teaching into specific steps. So we think about very specific things that we want our teachers to be able to do, and then we break those things down again so that we're giving teachers very bite-sized input. And then every week we are practicing these different things. We have what we call an action step, something that they're working on. And then we have a set of success criteria that help the teacher to do that action really carefully. And you'll see that what we also do is that we're constantly connecting these actions to our wider kind of mental model. The next thing that we do is that every teacher at Reach, someone comes and sees them teaching every week. And so they get personalized feedback every week, and they practice, they are rehearsing all of the techniques weekly. So those are kind of the 5 things that we're doing. We use instructional coaching to make sure that every one of our teachers is getting personalized feedback, but we're also trying to build a collective culture of rehearsal. I think one of the things that people that I think is underappreciated. Two ideas that I think are underappreciated in education is one, really deeply the real deep conviction that teaching is very, very difficult. So it's very unusual to have a profession which is a performance profession and which is so unpredictable. So, you know, if you are performing Macbeth, you know that the environment's going to be pretty stable. You know, people are not going to be shouting out from the audience. You know, the stage is going to be where you think it is. At the same time, once it starts, you can't stop it, which is also true of teaching. There are other things which are more unpredictable, but you can pause them, you can restart, you can start again. And I think as a profession, I think we don't spend enough time reflecting on the degree of difficulty that teaching provides and the number of unconscious and some conscious decisions that teachers are making. And so what teachers are doing all of the time, the only way to cope in a classroom is to build habits. And some of those habits will be really good habits, and some of those habits will be less effective to help children learn. And so what we spend a lot of time thinking about with teaching is how can we help our teachers to build really good habits? Amina, do you want to show a little bit of the clip from our classrooms?
Yes, I'll just start the video. Just let me know if any of my Zoom parts are obstructing the screen, right? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Is the sound good? Ed, could you hear the sound?
I could,
okay,
yeah.
great. All right, so we're gonna go through this video. I'll pause and move on to a particular timestamp where we can see a classroom, but we'll start with the intro. And, yeah.
Effective teaching is the biggest lever we have at our disposal for improving the learning and life chances of the young people in our care. The work that teachers do is easily some of the most important work ever done. However, it's also incredibly complex and often highly unintuitive, which is why in this series we're unpacking great teaching, what it is and how it works, so you can have even more concrete conversations about what better practice looks like in your context. Over the next 4 episodes, we're going to take a good close look at one configuration of seriously strong teaching across multiple lessons in 2 schools, one secondary and one all through, where we'll focus mostly on the primary phase. We're going to prioritise those areas of teaching which have the greatest potential for impact: harnessing student attention, teaching good behaviour, securing student success, and embedding effective teacher development. We believe these schools are good examples to share because they serve communities which experience high levels of disadvantage, they achieve exceptional academic outcomes, and they bring out the best in their students in terms of curiosity, confidence, and character. One last thing, when we see teaching that's unfamiliar to us, we can often experience an emotional response, maybe even some resistance. That's a completely normal human reaction, but if you want to get the most out of this series, then it's important you watch out for that response, that you remind yourself that these students and their parents are really happy with their experience, and just as you'd ask of your students, you keep as open a mind as possible. My name's Peps McRae, and this is Great Teaching Unpacked.
When I first came to Oxford Academy, everything was just so peaceful. No one was misbehaving, everyone was just focused on the task and got it done, and that really surprised me.
They make sure we're learning hard but at the same time also having fun, so then we don't get too bored during class.
We help each other by working together, by talking to our partner.
I really like the way that lessons are very fun, so you kind of like enjoy being in the space that you're in.
I feel like what changed in myself is probably my confidence. I don't feel like I was as happy as much as I am now, and I feel like I'm able to do a lot of things when I grow up.
culture and the personality here, because imagine if we were just all the same, it would be really boring basically.
The best schools are places where all children are supported to flourish in a broad range of ways, to help them live their best lives both in the now and in the future. This means offering a broad entitlement, including things like trips, sports, music, clubs and plays. However, in this series, we're going to just focus on how certain schools are doing a cracking job in the classroom. We're focusing on this because it's probably the most technical and least intuitive aspect of school. And when we get this bit right, it creates more time and space for the other pieces. When it comes to classroom learning, the single most important concept for us to have a clear handle on is attention. Attention is the currency of the classroom, the gatekeeper of learning. What our students pay attention to and think about is ultimately what they end up learning, which is why in this episode we're focusing on what these teachers do to harness attention, how they communicate in captivating ways, how they foster 100% participation, and how they catalyse extended thinking. We're going to kick things off by watching some footage of Nina, an awesome English teacher at ArcZone. Then afterwards, she'll analyse her teaching with Josh Goodrich, an expert in instructional coaching. Zone is a non-selective school in London where more than half the students come from families with low incomes and speak a language other than English at home. And it's widely regarded as having some of the best teaching in the UK. What you're about to see is a normal everyday lesson. We've very deliberately not staged anything for this series, so you can get a sense of the reality of these schools. As you watch, focus on how Nina captivates her students' attention and communicates in ways that gets her.
All right, just gonna fast forward.
Repetition, pausing, economy of language, storytelling, and action. Now, you don't need to be exactly like Nina to captivate attention. As long as these underlying principles are present in our teaching, the way they manifest can be very different depending on the unique personality that each of us brings to the classroom. You'll have noticed that, as well as communicating in captivating ways, Nina also uses structures and routines to get lots of her students participating. This is another common feature of effective teaching, and where we're going to take things with our next classroom star, Isla, a primary teacher from Reach Academy, Feltham. Reach is an all-through school in London which serves a community that experiences high levels of disadvantage and helps its students to make exceptional progress in every available measure. While you watch, notice how Isla uses some of the same strategies as Nina to captivate attention, but now also begin to turn your focus to how she locks in participation for every single student.
Back to the text. Now, Father Coram knows these Lapland witches, John Farr said, and if I ain't mistaken, there's an obligation there. That's right, John, said Father Coram. It were 40 years back, but that's nothing to a witch. Some of them live to many times that. What happened to bring this obligation about, Father Coram? Said Adam Stefanski, the man in charge of the fighting troop. Who has an obligation to the Egyptians? Annika?
The witches.
Can you answer in a full sentence, please?
The witches have an obligation with Egyptians.
Great, merit for you to reflect. I saved a witch's life, Father Coram explained. She fell out of the air, being pursued by a great red bird, like to nothing I'd seen before. Ria.
The other men murmured. Captured by Father Coram's story. Now when I got her in the boat, he went on, I had the most grim shock I'd ever known, because that young woman had no daemon.
It was as if he'd said she'd had no head. The very thought was repugnant. The men shuddered. Their demons bristled or shook themselves or cawed harshly, and the men soothed them. Pantalaimonium crept into Lyra's breast, their hearts beating together. Team tracker. Remember, this is our exit ticket. What is Father Coram and John Farr? What are they talking about here? What are they thinking about? The fact that the witch, what? Turn to your partner. Go. 3, 2, 1, and 0. What are they talking about here, please? Turn and track Seher.
We're talking about how the demon, the witch had no demon.
Great. The witch had no
demon.
Okay. How do the Egyptians react to this? How do the Egyptians react to the thought of a witch having no demon? Write it on your whiteboards, please, in 7. 6. 5. Hover. Radiate's hovering. East is hovering. Three, 2, 1. Show. Good. Really nice. Arav, I love how you included quotation marks to show you're quoting from the text. Merit for you for a spy. 1 and 2. Back to me. Team, lots of you have got amazing vocabulary on your boards. You've written that they shuddered, the demons bristled, that Father Coram reacted with a grim shock. Great. So they don't like the idea of not having a demon. How does Pan and Lyra react? What do Pan and Lyra do at the thought of not having each other? Turn to your partner. Go.
I guess they're like grateful that they have each other, and they're like scared, like if that was real.
And back to me. Write the quote on your board that shows me what Pan and Lyra, how they react to the thought of not having each other. Write the quote on your board. Go.
Can we pause there?
Yes.
Great, cool. I wanted to just pick up on a couple of the questions before we carry on and kind of talk about those 2 other areas. I think I think the question about the economic realities for students. Sorry, I'm just, since we're so here we are. So I think one thing that's interesting in the UK is how in different areas of the country, the financial return on the level of education is quite different. So generally in our cities, there is a better return on performing well at school, and you generally see kind of higher levels of motivation and higher levels of ambition, I think, from children in communities where there is a better return, and particularly where there are more kind of graduate, more skilled jobs. So that's kind of, that in some ways is in our favor. I haven't really talked about, we do a lot of work around the country, and certainly in a more rural communities, it's harder to make the case for getting a really, for continuing to staying in school and pushing on and attaining high levels, because there are relatively few jobs that are available to young people with high levels of qualification or who require high levels of qualification. I think that the question about, I would say we would probably lean more towards the performative, but I think we definitely need to see the value of working in teams. I think we're probably in a position where we are less, we're more kind of, we take a more of a direct instruction approach, which I think you can see in that lesson from Isla. And then I think the question about special educational needs is super interesting and really important. I think where we have got to, so there are various things that I think are interesting in this space. One of the things is that the data in the UK says that at some point in their school career, 40% of children are categorized as having a special educational need. So while we think of this as a quite small proportion, actually 40% of children at some point in their school journey are classed as having a special educational need. And I think we find it very helpful to think about our community as being on a continuum around these different levels of need. I think in general, the default is to seek to kind of educate that cohort of children separately. And particularly what tends to happen in the UK is that those children often have the least skill, the less skilled person working directly with them. So one of the things you will have seen is that Isla is on her own in that classroom. There are not teaching assistants and others. There are children who experience, who have special educational needs in that classroom, but as much as possible, we are trying to include them and support them in the wider group. It's hard to see sometimes on the video, but I think that there is an effort to make the teaching quite fast-paced, quite varied, but the structures that the teachers are using are very consistent across the school. So we're trying to create quite a consistent experience, particularly to support our children in terms of who are on the kind of autistic spectrum, so that there's a high level of consistency, a high level of predictability about the lessons, but that there is also enough variety and variation in terms of the diet, so that children that can kind of sustain attention. One of the things we do a lot of is kind of pre-teaching, so that children can access the learning in the classroom. And then we do a lot of in-class assessment and pupils needing additional support. We have a member of support staff who works with children about the content in the morning in their English and their maths that afternoon. Because the challenge for our elementary pupils is that there's going to be new content tomorrow and the day after and the day after. And if they're falling behind, that's a real challenge. And then the answer to the last question, that point around relationships, like that's a huge thing. And that's kind of a nice segue, I think, into the relationships with families. We would want our teachers, our expectation is that teachers are going to build really strong relationships with their pupils. One of the decisions that we made quite late on, before we opened the school, was we made the decision for all of our teachers to be on first name terms with pupils and with families. So they would call me Ed, for example, and that's a really important part, we think, of what's helped us to foster really strong relationships. So I'm just going to jump back. So I've talked about curriculum. I've talked a little bit about teaching. I think we're okay for time. So I'm going to jump in to talk about relationships.
Hi,
Please.
so sorry to interrupt. That your Zoom taskbar is actually obstructing the slides.
I don't know how to. Okay, I don't know how to.
The one on the left.
Oh, the one on the left. Oh, I'm so sorry. This one here. Is that better?
Yes, much better.
Great.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Okay, so I think, as I said, in our system, we have underestimated the extent to which relationships matter. And for us, when we look at our pupils, the results that they get, particularly the amount of progress that they make, is almost always perfectly matched, as it says in this quote from my colleague Rebecca, who I started the school with, to the quality of relationships that we have with the pupil and their family. And so there are 5 things I'd like to talk a little bit about. The first 2, I think, are, and I can't speak for yourselves and for the system in India, but I think the first 2 are things that leaders in the UK don't necessarily do that well. So the first one is around being asset-based. I think that there is a real tendency in schools in the UK to talk about the weaknesses, the limitations, the deficits, the problems in a community. So if you meet a school leader from the UK, they will very often say, I serve a very, very deprived community. They will go quickly to the negative. And I think one of the things that's really important in terms of building those strong relationships is to be asset-based, is to be really positive and to be really optimistic about the place. The second thing, again, I think, is that school leaders in the UK, I think, are much more comfortable being on transmit. They like to share out. They're not necessarily that good at listening and at being curious. And I think one of the really powerful kind of learning experiences that I have had was doing some training with Citizens UK, which is an organization that promotes community organizing. And someone asked me, how often do you have a conversation without an agenda in Feltham? And I realized that the answer to that was almost never. And when I most pretended I didn't have an agenda was when I most had an agenda. And so I think that kind of curiosity, that desire to listen, is again not necessarily something that is very prevalent in school leaders in the UK. We do a lot of home visiting, which I know is perhaps quite a normal thing in India. It's not the case in the UK. We're constantly thinking about building trust, which I'll talk about a little bit. And then we spend a lot of time training our staff to take a consistent approach to working with families. So I think that this is from the Stanford Social Innovation Review, and I think it's really helpful. You can read the quote here, but fundamentally, the argument that they're making in this article is that institutions don't always think about trust and the importance of trust. And they tend to, and you can see the quote in bold at the end, when something doesn't work, they tend to conclude their failure originated with the group they targeted rather than with their own approach. And I think this is very common in schools, where we try something, we don't necessarily think carefully about the conditions that are necessary for that intervention or that support to work. And then when things don't go well, we tend to blame our community and our beneficiaries rather than reflecting on our own choices. One of the things that we think is really important to do is around making this strong start. And for us, that home visit is really important to build a sense of partnership, to explain to parents what they can expect, to get to know the child early, that we think there's a real statement to coming to the family's home and to doing that, to making that kind of showing that commitment. And I think it connects to this idea of a relational bank. So this idea is we sort of use this metaphor a lot with our staff. We know that there will be times where we have to have difficult conversations with our families. That might be about there might be about a consequence that their child's received. It might be a difficult conversation about attendance in school. It might be a conversation about needing to make a referral to social care because we're worried about the risk of harm to the child. We know that we will have to make we will have to have those conversations, and we think about that as kind of making a withdrawal in terms of this bank of trust. And so if you know that you're going to have to make withdrawals, it means it's really important that as much as possible, you're taking opportunities to make deposits. And that's particularly true, we think, before the child starts or as the child is starting school. And as much as possible, we're trying to build that, strengthen that relationship, to make those deposits into this bank so that when we have to have that difficult conversation, we can have it and still have something left in this kind of bank of trust that we're building. And so for us, that home visit then becomes an important part of how we're making a deposit and we're building that sense of trust with our families. And then the other thing that we do is that we train our staff. And this slide is thinking about parents, family meetings. A lot of these practices in the UK are they're quite traditional. They're done in a certain way. And we've worked really hard to make sure that all of those interactions, our staff are really well trained to do them, but also as much as possible that we're using them to build trust. So we don't want our interactions to be transactional. We want them as much as possible to be relational and to be in service of strengthening this relationship. So a little bit of there about kind of fostering strong relationships, being asset-based, being curious, the power of doing home visiting, this point around building trust, and then the idea of a consistent approach from staff. Some teachers find this side of the work really hard. They're fantastic with the kids, but they find this side of the work really hard. And they need support to be able to build these relationships really well. I think this is particularly perhaps true of younger teachers, perhaps people who don't yet may not have their own families, and they can find this very intimidating. And so it's really important to us that we have this consistent approach, that we train, that we mentor, and that we support our teachers to be able to have these interactions and for them to go well. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about before I stop, and maybe we can have some questions, is just to think about the work that we do to kind of strengthen our community. So I talked about this idea of kind of a great school is necessary but not sufficient. We're trying to do kind of 4 things. One is building a range of partnerships and being outward facing. One thing is seeking to build capacity and to reduce stress, something around that making the system more coherent, and then something around kind of organizing around challenges. And I suppose I've got a couple of slides here that kind of speak to some of our beliefs. So this idea that schools are really important institutions in their communities, they're trusted, they have these long-lasting relationships, they're pretty deeply rooted, they're physically present, they are a universal service. So pretty much like every child in England is going to school. It's a really important kind of institution that can strengthen community. And they have this physical infrastructure as well. And so one of the things that we're constantly doing is trying to build these partnerships. And that involves really seeking to understand our community, to mapping the people, the institutions, the assets who are working in different areas in our community. We also look to map the physical assets. So we do a lot of work around making sure that we understand who are the individuals, but also who are the organizations that are working with young people. And then we build partnerships that help us to serve our pupils and our community. And those partnerships are doing different things. So we've got a counseling service with a charity called Place to Be. We work with an organization called Family Links who've trained some of our staff to run parenting classes. We work with Citizens, which is, I say, a community organizing network where we're building the leadership and the kind of power of our young people and of their families to kind of take action, to lead, to push for change, including kind of political change in our community. So we've got this kind of series of partnerships. I think sometimes schools are quick to ask parents to help, ask parents to read with their children, ask parents for support with maths teaching. They might want to build parental capacity, but they forget or they don't also invest at the same time in reducing stress. And often that stress is financial, that stress is to do with relationships, perhaps between parents, that stress might be to do with parental mental health challenges, all sorts of things. And for us, it's really important that we're building partnerships and we're creating support that reduces stress at the same time, or before even, we're trying to increase capacity. I wanted to share this example. It's not from Reach, but it's from one of our partners in a kind of more rural area of the UK, down in the southwest of England. And I think the reason I wanted to share it, it comes to this point around creating more coherence, but also around organizing around particular challenges. And so Dave, who is the head teacher of the school, he started by once a month, on the first Tuesday of the month, he would run a community breakfast. And it was a community leaders breakfast, and he had some parents who he invited, a couple of his young people, but then he also invited leaders from across the community, someone who managed the local shop, a counsellor, someone who worked for a charity, the local church. And they over a series of meetings, they started to organize around what are the challenges, what are the reasons why young people in Chard are not yet flourishing. And they used these monthly meetings to kind of organize around these different ideas. And what has come out is 3 big challenges that are affecting children. So there's very little support in the early years for babies. There are real problems with public transport and access to get people to work and also to college. And then there are a lot of children who are hungry in Chard. And what they now have is these series of kind of steering groups, working groups who are looking at these challenges. And you can see these are not really the core business of the school to address, but Dave has got people together to focus on how he can make his community stronger, how he can make the local system work better for his young people. And what's interesting about that is that he has got a huge amount of support that has come about where people have said, I understand this is a problem you face, let me help. I think our hypothesis is that if he had gone to those people himself and said, please, can you pay for breakfast for children who are living in poverty? Or please, can you hand over this community centre so that we can use it to support children in the early years? I think they probably wouldn't have said yes. But what he did was he said, look, this is the reality for young people in our community. This is what's happening at the moment. Can you help me to change it? Because at the moment, it's stopping our young people from flourishing. And that sense of a shared challenge and organizing around the shared challenge, I think has been extremely powerful. And we are working, Chard is one of 40 communities around the country where we're working. And particularly this kind of building relationships with families, and then this work around community strengthening has been really kind of evocative for people. So that's my kind of 4 areas. I'll whiz back up. Forgive me, here we are. So I've kind of talked a little bit about the curriculum, about teaching, and we had a chance to see Isla. I've talked a little bit about strong relationships with families, and then a little bit about kind of that community side. And as I say, I think numbers 3 and 4 here are probably the ones that schools is most different about what we're doing, recognizing that may not be the case in India. I'll stop sharing there and we can see if there are kind of questions or reflections folks might have.
Thanks for that, Ed. I see a few questions coming in. I think we had addressed a few that came earlier, right? I'm just going to take the most recent one by Rabin. Mass teaching is not ideal for tomorrow or day by day. What if in future AI-driven interactive character lead educational programs? How workable is that? What are the benefits and ethical implications of this? Okay. Thanks for typing that out, Rabin.
These are big questions. I would love to know your opinion, Rabin. I think it's interesting. I think post-COVID, I think there was a sense that tech would play a bigger role. I think a lot of most schools in the UK have gone back to a pretty traditional approach. I think we have really significant teacher shortages, or increasingly significant teacher shortages. And there are certainly schools that I know, particularly where there's schools in more remote areas, where they are moving towards having some teachers, particularly in shortage subjects, so that's mainly maths and science, where they have teachers who are completely remote. So the teacher is teaching the children on a computer, and that is their normal lesson. So they'll have a teaching assistant, a kind of unqualified person on the ground in the classroom, but each child is on headsets, but they're being taught live. There are a few, I think, I've seen some it's not so much AI, I think, as maths tuition, where the system responds to the pupils, where the children has got it right by giving them different types of questions and videos. I don't think we have the answer to this at the moment, Ravina. And I think one thing that is clear in the UK is that we have probably underplayed the importance of the most popular word in the buzzword in England at the moment in schools is belonging. And we've probably underplayed the importance of building that sense of belonging. And our sense is that probably it's the person-to-person side of things that will foster that sense of belonging the most. But really interested in your view if you wanted to come back in. But Vali, yeah, so Reach Academy Feltham is a school. It's a school that is completely state funded, so it's funded by the government. It's what's called an academy. So it's a kind of independently run but state funded school. The children don't pay any fees to attend. For our wider work with other schools around the country, we're funded a mix of fees from those schools. They pay to access our support, but then we do some fundraising. And for our wider community work in Feltham, again, it's partly funded by our local government and it's partly funded, again, philanthropically. I think one of the things that we've been very fortunate about is that we have been able to find donors who were interested in more kind of long-term work. So more of this kind of systems change work. And we've used models, so including the Strive Together model of collective impact in the US, where they have kind of indicators of systems change or enablers of systems change that you often see progress on before you see progress at kind of student outcome level. So I think often if you're trying to improve student outcomes most quickly, often the easiest way to do that is through quite kind of simple interventions. So phonics teaching, for example, the quality of reading instruction is probably going to have the biggest impact in the short term. In the longer term, some of this kind of deeper community work and working with the local system might have a bigger impact. Yeah. And then, yeah, I mean, I think a huge amount of focus is on that teacher-student relationship. I mean, I think that's a huge thing. I mean, I think that building motivation, building self-determination, building that range of skills that young people need to be able to flourish, like I think so much of that comes from the relationships they have with adults and with their peers. And so that feels really important. And I think we would see that being a kind of collective, communal kind of endeavor, not something that the child is doing really on their own. Albeit that I would say the instruction that you saw in that classroom with Isla was quite didactic, I guess.
Thanks for that, Ed. I do want to invite people to just come off of mute, and it'll be nice to hear some voices. If you'd like to just put in any questions, any insights that are coming up. Okay, Zara, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Zara. I joined in a little bit late in your session, but I really loved what you had to say. And this idea of systems change and the tug of war between systems change and immediate impact, which is like generally the pressure that we feel, right? Which is, as a nonprofit, like, what are you doing to improve these lives, and like how fast is it? And the systems change approach, as you said, if you have donors who kind of really believe in that, they can invest with you for a longer term. But I guess my question is that, is there a way to make a case for the systems change approach in communities where there's a lot of, especially poverty, in the context of there seem to be very immediate challenges, like at a very visceral level to solve. And then when you come and say that, hey, wait, like give us 20 years, let's take our time. There's sometimes like an impatience, there's also like a sense of hopelessness. So like, what's the best way to kind of approach that systems change aspect and make a case for it in communities where you see that that's really a need?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. Thank you, Sarah. And look, I think this work is super kind of contextual, and so I take what I say here with a pinch of salt. I think it's partly about the needs being really immediate and really visceral, as you say. I think it's also about all of our collective desire to feel like we're doing the right thing and making a contribution. I think for us, we feel like it's helpful to try to do both things together. And I think there are ways of working which are trying to build capacity, foster leadership, build agency, build a sense of self-determination amongst our young people, but particularly amongst our families more broadly, and to to organize things like governance and sort of decision making in a way that is more participatory, with more co-production. So it may be that you're still doing that direct delivery because you're addressing that immediate challenge, but the way that you're approaching that work is thinking with a kind of systems change, capacity building, power sharing kind of attitude, which I think at the heart of it, it comes back to the thing I was saying earlier about being asset-based. Like, I think if you've got this idea that there are real assets, there are real strengths, there are brilliant people in this community. This is a community that historically has been underserved, has been under-resourced, you know, by the state. This is not a weak community, and the orienting ourselves to try to build that leadership, I think, is one way that we can pivot between addressing the immediate challenge, but also building capacity to be able to drive change in the long term. I'd love you to come back on how you react to that.
No, and I hear you. I think that a lot of it has to do with just like believing that there's potential in an area, right? And being like, there's not inherently like a flaw that's preventing people from progressing, but it's just a lack of investment. I guess, and I think that when you're aligned in that belief, it like that want to invest, there's that broken window syndrome context, which is, you know, very much so like alignment in this, that if you build it well, it'll flourish. But I guess my point is a little bit like, how do you get to that point? So I guess like if you have enough momentum where, like you said, that you have people who kind of really believe in this approach, but is there a turning point? Like, did you feel like there was a wave that you were riding where like there was overall a demand for systems change and then you guys kind of came in and filled it? Or did you kind of create that wave? And what are ways to kind of create it?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, I think we're still making that case. I think you have to constantly be making that case. I think particularly, again, I can't speak for your context, but certainly in the UK, people kind of roll their eyes a bit at this language, you know, kind of systems change, co-production, being asset-based, like people kind of were like, oh, whatever, yeah, fine, especially people in schools. I think what helped us was the fact that we were running a school and it was a good school and it was successful and the outcomes were good. So that really helped to kind of build our credibility and build, and then I think the other thing is like, the thing that I personally have done over the last kind of 13 years is invest a ton of time in, I mean, my colleagues would call it schmoozing. Like, I go out and I have coffee with people, and ideally people who are wealthy, and I ask them if, you know, I tell them about the challenge. I think one of the things is kind of, this is the challenge we face, this is the work we want to do, this is what we want to do more of. And I think at the end of that, saying, is there anyone you know who would be interested in this work? Is there anyone you know who might help us to do this? And I think having that kind of constant sort of desire to build a network that can help. So I think there's a local context of credibility. I think there's also then a wider context of credibility, and then there is that kind of relationship building that you're both doing locally. But you know, our community is not one that is affluent. It hasn't got those high net worth people. So for those, you know, I'm sort of seeking out those people and those kind of introductions, and I'm really proactive about trying to kind of build those kind of personal relationships, and also trying to foster those over a long time. So I think trying to build, you know, trying to meet and trying to share the work, get people to visit, having 3, 4, 5 conversations before we would have a conversation about support, you know, and I would be wanting to check and get permission to make that ask. And even if I never do make that ask, like trusting that relationship could lead to other opportunities down the road I think that gets to kind of time allocation as a leader, because I'm spending more time doing those things, you know, and at the expense of some things locally, and sometimes at the frustration of my colleagues or my, you know, some of our beneficiaries as well.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Zara. I know I see a few hands up. I just want to point out Jayashree's question. On one end, we try to enhance the competencies of children and also want to prepare them for long-term goals. How do we balance both? Jayashree, if you're able to give more voiceover, feel free to come off of mute for that.
Maybe I'll go on, Joshua.
Yes, I'm Jayashri. I just wanted to know that with respect to the changing scenarios which is happening all over the world globally, children are definitely affected. So they are definitely affected globally, geopolitical, geography, a lot of changes happening. So on one hand, they receive these messages from news, parents talking. And on the other hand, we want them to also develop their skill sets, competencies. So yeah, they are disturbed in some way or the other. So how do we, channelize that, okay, it's fine. We need to concentrate on our context, our curriculum. So let's not be affected what's happening globally. We need to focus with respect to our skill sets, how to develop a right mindset so that the teachers, we educators can really bring that level of balance in the classroom. So this is what I wanted to know. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's such a complicated question. So I suppose one thing is having a really clear kind of vision for the institution and a really clear sense of purpose for the institution so that you aren't asking too much of your staff in terms of their ability to lead this kind of and make these decisions on their own. I think that's one thing. I think the second thing is to avoid a sense of dichotomy. So you're either doing this or you're doing this. I think to a large extent, like if you can support children's well-being and their mental health, and that will support them learning well, making progress. I think there's a further challenge between kind of building students' kind of leadership and agency versus helping them to be successful with the kind of in the system as it is today. So in the exams that we have and so on, we are, I would say, fairly traditional or fairly kind of conservative in some ways in terms of wanting to push our community, wanting to push our students to succeed in the system as it is, because we think that's really important to give them the chance to access that kind of life of choice and opportunity. But I think trying to avoid, as I say, a sense of those kind of false dichotomies is probably, well, not false, and they're not false dichotomies, but trying to build a kind of both and system, I guess, would kind of be my answer. I think I'll come to Anjali in a second, but on Shashail's question, sorry for my pronunciation.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. So I think that our teachers have the same amount of time as other teachers in the UK, which is kind of half a day, an afternoon a week to do their planning and preparation. The thing that I would say is we work very hard to be intentional about what teachers are doing in that planning and preparation time and trying to reduce workload as much as possible. So one big decision that we made quite a few years, about 5 years ago now, is that our teachers don't, except for a few English teachers, our teachers don't mark books outside of lessons. I mentioned that we look at pupils' books during the lesson. We decide whether they need catch-up support in the afternoon. Other than that, we're not marking, and that takes a lot of time outside of lessons. We also, because I mentioned when we were doing the curriculum, we have all of the curriculum kind of laid out. So we talk about our teachers preparing to teach rather than having to resource lessons themselves. And as much as possible, we are trying to be very specific about the things that we want our teachers to be doing kind of outside of lessons. And as much as possible, if we're introducing something new, we tell them what we want them to do less. So often I think teachers get more and more added on top of what they've got to do, and actually trying to manage and help them to manage their workload explicitly is probably the thing. Anjali, come in.
Hi, thank you so much. I was thinking about the metaphor of the relational bank and just how helpful that is. And also thinking about that slide with the increased capacity and decreasing stress. And I'm sort of thinking of that as a lever, and it makes so much sense that in order to increase capacity, we also need to logistically and practically make it possible for parents. Like we might be able to be very concrete and this is how we need reading support. But if the issue is noise at home or commute or whatever, food insecurity, whatever it is, those are the things that we need to address first. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the kinds of things that you are able to do on the reducing stress bucket, because it can get so diverse and so nitty-gritty. So I was wondering if you could share some examples. And the second one is kind of a separate question, and if there isn't enough time, feel free to choose either. But I was also wondering, with the emphasis on attention, I was thinking about how special education is so difficult in especially in lower income schools and classrooms. So I'm imagining the classrooms are neurodiverse, and I was wondering whether there's anything special that's done there on the attention piece. Thank you.
Thank you. Ranjana, do you want to come in and ask your question as well? And then I can pick up that one and Ravathi as well.
Sure. Actually, some of the part of my question has been already answered by you, but still, I would like to know, like, the model which you are talking about, is it like applicable to any kind of school, like irrespective of the, like, maybe you can say about the fee structure, or maybe like primary, secondary, is there a particular like group of children which you are looking at? Or, and the second question is like how the teachers are being trained on it, and then like how the lesson plan, how the model goes into the lesson planning of the teacher. Like you talk about the community engagement of the teachers and all, so how does it go into the lesson planning of the teachers in context of India?
Yeah, thank you. So I'll whiz through these, and I've got Ravathi's question here about the theory of change. So, I mean, I think on the reducing stress, I think probably the main thing, Anjali, is to be accessible and to be a place that parents see as someone who they can go to in a time of crisis, so that you are able to support in those situations. So, different things happen, right? Sometimes it's helping to go to the housing department to get support with housing. Sometimes it's buying a family, a cooker or a fridge on occasion. Very often, I think probably the biggest thing I would say is, and I think we probably all experience this in our own lives, it's very therapeutic when someone listens to you, when someone takes time. And one of the things we work very hard on is to keeping parents in mind, using their name, like if we don't see them for a week or two, contacting them, checking in with them, doing those sorts of things. And also, I think, trying to foster relationships between parents and within the community. So there's a lot of evidence that, 8 or 9 out of 10 people, if they need help, they go to a friend or a family member. That's what most of us do, right? We don't phone up a helpline. We don't go and see someone from the council. We speak to someone we trust. And I think what's really clear, I think, is people are increasingly isolated. They're often living far away from their extended families. And so they don't necessarily have that network locally. And so some of this is about fostering those relationships, and things like the parenting stuff that we do is as much about building connection between people, and then being really available and accessible, and then really leaning in times of crisis so that we can help. I also think the home visiting helps with really kind of building understanding. It's really interesting, especially when you're talking about younger children, how often when there is a learning problem, challenge, when you do a home visit, you find that it's very often about sleep, and the child just isn't sleeping. Often they've got, like, I don't know, a TV in their room, or they've got whatever it is, in this is in my context. And similarly about diet, and they're not eating, those sorts of things. So I think you're trying to identify those sorts of things. But at the heart of it, I think, comes back to, as you say, your bank analogy. If you've got that trust, it's most likely that the person will kind of come to you. On the send side, I mean, I think we would be saying quite strongly that good teaching is good teaching for this cohort of children. And I think we're guilty in the UK a lot of pretending this is something different. Clearly, there are children who will need some adjustments, but the vast majority of children will benefit from the same kind of inclusive strategies, being explicit about things, being transparent, having a consistent approach, naming the steps, all of these sorts of things. And so while I definitely think there are adjustments that are being made in the school all the time, and particularly on the kind of social and emotional kind of behavioral stuff, there's a lot of stuff going on, and there's a certain amount of kind of plate spinning, that teachers are doing. Most of this is about supporting every child to be able to succeed. I think, Ranjana, that what I would say about, this is a school that is kind of a state school. It's free to get into. We prioritize children whose families are growing up in poverty. I think, again, I would say the majority of children we think will benefit from this coherent approach. We think that's a good thing. I think there are some young people who are just incredibly resilient. We all know those young people who are super successful. I think who have that maturity and that kind of resilience kind of before their time. I think we're hoping that what our approach can do is to support the majority who aren't quite there yet. And then I think on the training side, I mean, I talked a little bit about the teacher development piece in terms of the mental model, in terms of being very explicit, in terms of practicing, rehearsing as a group outside of lessons, and then in terms of giving individualized feedback. Like, that's a very kind of systemic kind of model that we use. We then help our teachers. We have all the curriculum available, and then we have what's called co-planning. So teachers will sometimes prepare to teach. So we talk about lesson preparation as distinct from kind of resourcing. So historically, I think teachers spend a lot of time resourcing, like, what are we going to learn about the Romans, or where am I going to find a worksheet, or what's the activity, or I'm making a poster, or I'm, whatever it is. We're trying to say, no, we want you preparing to teach this class. That means you're rehearsing what exactly you're going to say, what questions you're going to ask, which pupils are going to need extra help with this, what help are you going to provide? And so giving teachers some kind of coaching around that. And then I suppose the last thing is the question around the theory of change, which I suppose big picture is kind of what I've shared. It's kind of a strong curriculum, great teaching, strong relationships with families, and then this kind of community orientation. I think we aim to keep as many of our students as possible through to 18, and to give them kind of a wide range of choices at that stage. Definitely kids, as they get older, kind of need different things. They become more independent. I think often, the quality of careers advice that kids are getting in the UK isn't really strong enough, particularly if they don't have those role models in terms of a range of careers kind of in their lives already, in their immediate family or in their community. So we do a lot of work around that, around kind of workplace visits and mentoring opportunities. But I think that's always an area that we're trying to strengthen. And then I think to Anushka's question, conscious of all of your time, but to Anushka's question, it is time consuming. We aim to do it at the beginning of every year. The teachers tend to go to see their kind of tutor group, so they're 30 students, and we might try and do that over 5 or 6 different evenings. I think there's a point, Anushka, about the relative prioritization. So I suppose, like, particularly for our primary teachers, if a child is not attaining well, is struggling in school, we would encourage the teacher to do a home visit. Now, that might take an hour after school on a certain day, like they couldn't do 30 of those a week. They might only be able to do 1 or 2, but we would want to do that because otherwise the teacher might spend a long, long time developing kind of materials, support materials to support that child in class, when actually like the problem is they're not sleeping, or the problem is there's real conflict between their parents. And sort of having that orientation to, I know that there are factors beyond the classroom that are affecting how this child is doing, and I want to be curious about what's going on there and how I can help that family and that child before I start changing my curriculum, giving them extra lessons, doing other things.
But are the parents always comfortable with the teachers coming around and interrupting in their privacy?
I mean, with a warning, you know, obviously with notice. I'm not just banging on the door.
Of course.
But
like a heads up would be good.
Yeah, yes, I think so. Partly because we set that expectation at the beginning. You know, I think this is the point about the building trust at the start. This is part of what we do. We're going to come and see you. We're a team. We're going to be together for a long time.
Right.
We're gonna have times where this isn't working well, right? You're going to be annoyed with us sometimes. We're going to be frustrated. Your child is a child. Like, they're going to have difficult times. They're going to get into trouble. This stuff's going to happen, right? But we're going to be a team and we're going to work through it. And I think that's a much easier conversation to have up front than when there's a problem, you know?
So is this for like all the grades or only the primary kids?
No, all the grades. But I think we do it more with the primary kids. Because it's harder to get that insight from the children themselves, whereas as they get older, it's a little bit easier and they're a bit more independent. But definitely we do these home visits in secondary as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Ed. I largely think that's it for the questions. Everyone, thank you so much for sending in such insightful questions and staying back to hear the responses. And of course, thank you, Ed, for doing this, for putting this together, and also the resources for the teacher training that you had so graciously sent to us. Awesome. If you are comfortable sharing your email and other ways to connect with you, Ed, feel free to please put this in the chat. Thank you. Ed's email is in the chat for anyone who want to reach out to him. And thank you again. I think we're coming to a close. Thank you so much, Ed. This was really, really useful.
Really lovely to talk to you all, and congratulations on all that you're doing. And I will look forward to staying in touch and hope that you have a great rest of your days. Thanks, folks.
Thank you. Bye-bye. For everyone else, we're just putting a poll on the chat on your screens. If you can just respond on your way out. And have a great rest of the evening.